not that we will do, all of data, step one, step two, step three, and then all of cloud, step one, step two, step three. These work holistically together, and operators need to consider the transformation from the whole view. You need to think about how data feeds into cloud and how data and cloud feed into automation, and we'll come on to that towards the end. But what we wanted to share up front was just a little bit of the thinking on each of those sub stages and kind of from the survey where we feel like operators are to date in that journey. So if we deep dive into data exploitation first, what we've got, and we've got this actually as a common thread throughout the four pillars, is this idea of a 2x2. And this is how we've defined those three stages that operators may go through. Now, this 2x2 for data is looking at on the y-axis, so from the bottom to the top, the idea of breadth of adoption. Is this something that is intra-domain within a team or within a unit, or is it something that is increasingly cross-domain, so I can use it across my organization and across networks, OSS, BSS, IT, etc. And on the x-axis, we think about technical maturity. How advanced is the capability that we're deploying, from more basic observation and cataloging in terms of data to then more AI and ML driven tools and insights. Step one, we feel like for operators, which was echoed by pretty much all 20 that we spoke to and then echoed again in the survey, was that the first step for data is to strive towards a common data model. And what I want to emphasize here, and we'll emphasize again on the next slide, is that this is not a data warehouse. This is not classic big data. It isn't just about storing everything that you can in a big centralized repository. It's about thinking about the governance around data. It's about thinking, how can I make sure that data from different vendors is cataloged or referenced in a similar way? How can I make sure that I got the context around the data to make it useful? And step one is we feel like you may do that intra-domain. So you'll start small. You'll start thinking about your network data or your access network data and thinking about how you can start to build up a more common data model or a common data culture around that. And that will obviously drive basic business intelligence within your team, but will also start to drive more observability of data from other departments. So you can start to at least understand what's going on with data from other areas and start to think about your own common data fabric or data mesh, as some people call it. The second step then we see is moving in more into that cross-domain bucket. So of course, starting to bring in some level of advanced tools, but thinking about, okay, I've got my common data model. How can I refine that now? Step two is refining that common data model such that data from other teams can now be observed and utilized in a more automated way in your basic data intelligence work and in your data analyst work. So this data now sits under a refined model. And when in stage two, you as a user can access it in right time, in real time, and you can generally access that through more automated dashboards that report and show a single view, I suppose, of those data sets. And again, becoming increasingly important as we do move towards more multi-vendor stacks, making sure that data from Ericsson, Nokia, Huawei is cataloged in a similar way. And even though they may have three different languages, you can use them with similar context. So I think a part of that refined data model becomes increasingly important as we move towards more open networking. And the next step then, the final step, is a big jump to start leveraging more AI and ML tools. So rather than investing a lot of effort and time in trying to bring more advanced tools to data that isn't well engineered, what we suggest is that this is the final step. So you start to now bring data analysts and scientists into the commonplace recruitment processes rather than them having to do heavy data engineering tasks. You start to leverage AI and ML tools to drive towards new insights that maybe wouldn't have been achieved by humans before and away from basic business intelligence. And now we think that the data is well governed. There's good data management structures in place. You can start to think about how to monetize externally, because it's difficult for telcos to start to think about external monetization until they've practiced what they preach, I suppose. If you have good data protocols internally, you can think about monetizing that externally. So those are the three steps through the program that we defined around data exploitation, from building the common data model to refining that with a cross-domain flavor to then thinking about how you leverage more AI and ML tools that are emerging. And what we wanted to do through the survey was kind of plot, where do telcos self-reflect that they are? So this wasn't our value judgment. This was very much based on where telcos, through a kind of iterative process, would consider themselves placed on this maturity framework. And as you can see, around 50%, just over half, consider themselves more towards bucket one. And again, this is a spectrum. It's not that you suddenly hit this milestone one and then you hit milestone two. Of course, there are capabilities that overlap here, but generally 50% of operators considering themselves towards bucket one, with just shy of a third then moving towards actually refining this data model across their teams, starting to think about how data can be observable and used with different organizations or units. And then 20% actually saying, well, yeah, we think we've got a lot of that data work done. We've moved fast in data. Players like Telefonica, for example, that have been investing in their data management capabilities for kind of over 10 years now, thinking about not just data lakes, but instead this common data fabric and where does data need to reside locally versus not. And they're now leveraging that investment to think about how they monetize externally and bring in some of those new emerging tools and the hype around AI and ML. So in terms of the recommendations at a general level, because most of the operators that we've surveyed here are sitting more towards stages 1 and 2, we do think an investment priority should be for operators that don't have the common data model. So thinking about data in a more common framework and with common terminology across teams. And again, emphasis that this is not a data warehouse. This is thinking about the governance and thinking about the secure and right time access. And of course, as we'll come on to later on in more detail, having a good data management capability is not just the foundation for external monetization of data, but actually a strong foundation for what we'll see in terms of automation and exposure. So it becomes quite a foundational piece on top of which you drive future automation. And the last thing I wanted to touch on with this slide is we had a stat recently from one of the network equipment providers that we were speaking to that was saying by going through this relatively difficult process with an operator of cataloging data under this common refined data model, they've now managed to reduce the time on data scientists and data analysts that they do engineering work by 70%. So if we think about data skills split by kind of those in more ML and AI ops, those in more data engineering, and then those that provide reporting and visualization, actual analytics and value to scientists and the analysts, 70% of the time now going to data engineering for the telco, you can drastically reduce that and shift more of the focus to analysts. And I think that will help you retain talent or acquire talent, which I know is an issue for some operators at the moment. How do we keep tier one data analytics skills when all of them want to go to the hyperscalers? Well, I think having a lot of this data engineering work done so they've got a solid foundation to use themselves will be key, because you'll reduce all of the hassle that they need to go through in engineering as well. So the next step that we wanted to go through, and again, reminder, do please jump in with questions, or if you have questions that you want to address later, throw them in the chat. The next bucket then that we looked into was cloud and cloudification and programmability. And similar to data exploitation, we've got the 2x2 here, where on the y-axis, we've got intra-domain versus cross-domain. But in terms of technical maturity, here we're looking at how softwareized is the network versus how programmable is the network. And when we talk about programmability, we're very much thinking about the flexibility in the network, kind of the software skills. So not just is the network virtualized, but am I managing the network in a software-driven culture? And have I moved more towards this idea of flexible, cloud native, etc.? And what we see as step one is a big shift within domains, within the access network, within the core, within specific functions, towards a more software-driven network. And that, of course, is epitomized by virtualization, where a significant portion of the core network and IT may start to move towards virtualized infrastructure. I think RAN, user plane may be slightly further down the line, but generally we're seeing the majority of at least planned deployments, including virtualized infrastructure. The next step for us, or the second step here, was in disaggregation and opening up more of those interfaces. So looking at infrastructure across, core RAN, IT being software-based, but now we're moving towards that common off-the-shelf hardware and possibly workloads running on more of that common hardware platform. And again, here we're thinking disaggregation may not be in all of deployed deployments, but maybe in the majority of planned deployments or upcoming deployments. So breaking down those network functions or those proprietary network stacks into smaller components that may then be able to be run with separate vendors, or may be able to be run in different geographies. So the example we often use with the BBU breaking that down into the CU, the DU, the RU, running those possibly with different vendors and in different locations. And again, we've taken the jump here into the programmability box. It's very much thinking about modular IT architectures, moving towards more open software best practice. But we're also starting to think here about more agile and cross-domain. And we've put here in brackets the CTIO, because again, one of the key findings from this program, or one of the key points of validation, was the strength of how the strength of a CTIO group can really drive transformation for operators in the move to cloud native. So rather than CTO versus CIO, or where we did speak to some tier one operators where the CTO was very much IT is a different kettle of fish. We can't take best practice from IT because they just don't understand the network. Moving away from that siloed mentality towards more of a CTIO group where IT may handle some of network architecture, and you get more overlapping capabilities, more synergies, and the move towards more programmability. And then the next step is to become more fully cross-domain, and we've called this modular technology and agile operations, because what was very much stressed through the interview program and the survey was the need for not just a microservice architecture, but that architecture to be common across fixed and mobile, where it can be, to be common across consumer and enterprise propositions. So you have the network split into these modules that can then be flexibly pieced together to create more compelling or differentiated propositions. And the idea that leveraging that or having to build multiple different stacks and for every different product, for every different customer segment, was becoming too arduous and difficult, and it's not as agile. Moving towards more of a microservice-based architecture with these common building blocks would enable operators to actually shift towards as-a-service models and that more flexible networking and dynamic networking that has been promised in that future vision. And of course, here, it may be that you're leveraging multiple cloud platforms, some of which will come from the hyperscalers, some may be more private cloud, but the idea is you're not stuck into one hyperscaler or to one network equipment provider, but instead you've broken out of that and are looking to drive more open best practice. And again, in terms of mapping where operators are then on this journey, we see that almost 70% of operators are still, around that virtualization phase. So 39% saying, yeah, we're probably at or past step one, but actually 31% still saying, well, we're not sure we've actually reached or surpassed stage one yet. So virtualization still being a core focus for the industry and for a lot of the operators that we surveyed. And again, I think this is important in terms of the recommendations, because there is a lot of learnings that can be taken from those operators, the kind of 30% or so that are at step 2 or 3, because I think they've had quite a difficult journey on the route to where they are. There's been a lot of investment, a lot of integration, a lot of testing for not what I think they would say a lot of promised realized gains. Virtualization and disaggregation hasn't brought a huge amount of cost savings on the books for those operators, because I think they would say they had limited re-architecting of the functions they were using. They tried to just virtualize as was. There was less modernization, and they probably invested less in the business model transformation side to become more agile and more programmable. So looked at kind of this cloudification angle as something that you buy rather than something that you do. So for those 70% of operators that are still yet to push into stage 2 and that disaggregation, there's some learning that you can take away to kind of leapfrog what those other operators have done and say, okay, well, actually, we will modernize. We will think about the new business model for driving cloud and the end goal here, rather than trying to virtualize legacy functions to get faster efficiency gains through things like SRIOV and DPKs, etc. So those are what we saw as the kind of natural progression within cloudification and programmability. The next step is automation. And I think the reason that we've done it kind of cloud, data, automation, and then automation and exposure is because if I go kind of one back, we think about cloud and we think about data as almost those foundations that enable these other pillars, right? Why would I invest as an operator in automating or in exposing legacy elements of my network? If it's in software, it's easier and it's moved more future-proof. 6G won't come around now for another 8 or so years, right? So this network that we have is if we invest and we move towards virtualized and disaggregated best practice, we can then implement automation on top of a future-proof network, rather than investing in doing that for a network that we'll have to swap out sooner or later. And so if we do then dive into automation again, the 2x2 here of intra-domain versus cross-domain, the technical maturity looking at basic automation like RPA through to more intelligent automation driven by things like AI and ML, etc. And again, the first step being intra-domain basic automation, we think there's a lot of value that telcos can extract by looking at process automation of very manual processes. For example, an example we'll come on to is in the BSS side, where there's a lot of customer tickets and data that needs to be presented. If you can automate that, which could be a very manual task for an individual to do, that could save a lot of time and a lot of operational costs. So there's a lot of value that operators can still do in this intra-domain basic automation piece. And generally, we're looking at simple decisions to action algorithms here. But then kind of opposed to data, where we went into cross-domain first, trying to build that refined common data model before looking into building in intelligence. We think it's slightly flipped for automation. Based on the conversations and the survey that we've had, we actually think there's a lot of value for operators once they've got that refined common data model. And now thinking within a domain, how do we build more intelligence and build more skills and capabilities to use zero touch and to think about how we drive initiatives that will move us towards more autonomous networking. And that may happen within a domain rather than trying to boil the ocean and do this completely end-to-end in the first instance. So then, of course, in the third stage, think about cross-domain automation, end-to-end, more closed loop. So thinking the step here from basic automation of processes within a team or a domain to more advanced automation of processes within a domain, to then thinking, okay, how do I now automate across my network and OSS and IT to create a more automated customer journey? So we spoke to a number of operators that said, look, we're taking a customer-centric approach. We want to understand if a customer wants to buy X service in X way, how do we do that in a very automated spin-up, spin-down model? And that requires automation across network, OSS, IT infrastructure as well. So we see that as kind of towards the end goal here in terms of our process. And again, mapping where we think operators are, we're looking at around kind of 70% or so again towards basic automation and starting just to implement some of those more early stage models around how to automate networks, with some then moving towards more advanced. But again, we're getting less mature here. As said, there's a lot of investment in data and cloud that needs to come first, but lots of quick wins that operators can make in that automation of manual processes to drive OpEx efficiency before trying to push forward with the self-healing, fully autonomous network, for example. So we think there's a lot of good stuff to do in that middle section. But of course, we should start thinking about now innovation within those BUs. So how do we bring in some intelligence to what we're doing so that automation becomes more effective? And I think importantly, you start to build the skills around automation. And that's something we haven't spoken about much yet today. But by looking at how to build intelligence within a team and not just necessarily outsourcing this all to an external vendor, but working very closely with them to accelerate, you'll start to build your own software and automation skills, which will become essential, I think, when it comes to automation further down the line in cross-domain, as well as in API exposure and monetizing APIs successfully. So that building of your own software and automation skills to some extent so that you can self-serve later on. And of course, relying on some partners to help you accelerate that skills building, but not necessarily just outsourcing. And actually, one example that we've got here is Gen AI and customer care. So that's an AI intelligent application and to some extent automation that you could apply within a business unit that leverages, obviously, of course, the data foundation, but also some level of automation within an area. So it may not touch the network, it may not touch the OSS, but within that sales customer care area, looking at how early uses of Gen AI might start to improve outcomes and improve upsell potential. So it doesn't have to be cross-domain, but certainly starting to think about some of that upcoming intelligence and that upcoming capability and how we apply it within a specific area. So that's one example of where operators could start to bring intelligence into their automation journey within a domain. Okay, so the last kind of pillar that we had was API exposure. And again, we've got the 2x2 here thinking about intra-domain versus cross-domain. And then in terms of the x-axis, we've thought here about internal exposure of APIs versus external exposure of APIs. And the first step here from kind of total legacy is looking at internal API maturity. So how are your APIs commonplace to drive automation, again, basic automation, but also are you leveraging southbound APIs to work with vendors on assurance and work with vendors on optimization and partly, I guess, the blurring lines here between networks and OSS. So how are you building your own internal API skills so that you can drive towards, as I said, automated assurance? And I don't know if you can read some of the quotes here, but one I'd like to call out is from the CTO of the tier one North American operator on the right, where they feel like they've got good internal API maturity, and they say, yeah, look, we've got 600 plus internal APIs ready to expose to vendors through our own API gateway and an own API marketplace. And I think it's interesting because, of course, they are mature there. They have invested in step one. But for me, what it showed was maybe they were lacking step two, which was around how to actually think about northbound API discovery, because this is about exposing in a simple way, in a standards driven way to developers, the developer community, so that they can build APIs into their apps around the network, like they've done with CPaaS and with voice and messaging, etc. And to think about a developer being able to make sense of or leverage 600 plus internal telco APIs is chaos to me. I think that shows that they've thought very much about step one, but not so much about step two, which is how do we think about the simplicity of the APIs that we offer to help test the model for as a service and help test the model for what developers really want. So I think what's clear here is that telcos need to consider, how they take the internal API work they're doing, but make it much more simple for developers and external enterprise customers to leverage. That's the key part of what step 1 to 2 is that simplicity of the proposition. And then what you think about is, okay, well, I want to monetize my APIs at scale. And this is where you start to build a more diverse portfolio of northbound APIs, and you start to build out more availability of those, and you start to differentiate possibly even from the standards. So whereas within the northbound API discovery segment, you're probably still working within siloed product teams, but needing to become more standards driven. When it gets to step 3, you probably have a centralized strategy around APIs, and you're thinking about working with Kamara and TMF and the GSMA and with MEF on driving those standards. But you might also start then thinking about more decentralized innovation of APIs, because of course, if all telcos follow the same standards around APIs and all launch the same APIs as part of their product set, there's less differentiation, and you become a commodity based on APIs rather than a commodity based on SIMs or connectivity. So, part of what we see is that step from initial launch of standards-driven APIs to this API monetization is that you may start to differentiate, as said, within these more decentralized units and product teams that then again start creating new services and new value around these APIs. So again, the jump up here, bringing that more diverse portfolio of northbound APIs, but also bringing some level of innovation beyond the standards. And so a bit of a summary here on the right in the key recommendations. We've talked about the 5 S's of exposure, of API exposure, and these 5 considerations that you need to make to drive scale. One of those, as we've said, is simplicity. So you can't expose 600 telco APIs because that would be a mess. Developers won't understand how to use it. You won't be able to provide enough support and guidance and SDKs and notifications and handover guidance on how that's used. So it needs to be a much more simple proposition. You need to think about how you break down silos initially so that it's not small product teams just working on this on their own and not thinking about the end customer and not thinking about the standards-driven or federated approach. But of course, you then need to balance standardization with speed of innovation and the ability to differentiate. So how do you start to work towards the standards to build up the skills, to build up the credibility with developers, to build up your own ecosystem, to then think about, now I can innovate and differentiate because I've built those skills, I understand the standards, I've been a key contributor to those metrics. And the last one, again, is security, much more on the technical side, on the architecture side. But as we move away from just network information driven APIs like latency and jitter or location, and we move towards more network orchestrating API-driven use cases, there will be a security angle here. And so it's a key consideration, and I'm sure obviously everyone on this call is aware of that. But thinking about how you work with partners and you participate in catalysts and proof of concepts to drive towards that secure driven networking so that you can enable network orchestration or network orchestrating APIs effectively. And again, if we plot in the bubbles where different operators are, the overwhelming majority is still early days, especially when we look beyond kind of the tier ones in North America and Europe to Latin America, parts of Africa and Southeast Asia. We do see that even the internal APIs is still relatively new and looking at how to use southbound to engage with vendors. But some more advanced, those obviously that are part of the GSMA Open Gateway initiative, thinking about stage 2, and some starting to think, okay, well, look, how do we take our skills in CPaaS, for example, with Deutsche Telekom, and leverage that in a NAS or network as a service world. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the 4 pillars of transformation and the 3 sub-stages. Again, any questions, do please pause me or throw them in the chat. But what we said at the beginning of the session was, you don't look at data exploitation and do stage 1, 2, 3, and then look at cloud and do stage 1, 2, 3. You have to think of this more as a holistic journey, and these aren't mutually exclusive. They will interact and overlap. And as said, there are some elements of data and cloud that you need as the foundation to then build into automation and exposure. So the next section that we quickly wanted to run through before I hand over to Ron was just thinking about how a timeline or a roadmap could look for this. What's the staging? And thinking about at which points value is unlocked for the operator. So we've kind of plotted it on this map, and I'll take it through kind of step by step. So we see the first step, that idea of laying the foundations, being investment in that common data model, the early stages of that common data model, and in a more virtualized network infrastructure. So making sure that the network is softwareized, because we feel like that's the bedrock on top of which you do the next phase, which generates more efficiencies through basic automation of that now non-legacy network, and start to build more automation through internal API maturity. And you'll work with vendors to drive more assurance instead, and more automated assurance and best practice in OSS. So you start working, of course, on refining that common data model to drive more cross-domain. You start thinking about disaggregating the network with a focus a little bit more on leveraging the investment in good data practice and in softwareized networks to drive early stage automation and internal API maturity. We see the third stage then is really about optimizing your operations. So in this step, you've got more cross-domain data that's available and reported and automated. You can drive insights not just within a single unit, but across units. And you've got really good governance around that data and data management and extraction protocols. You're leveraging that data to drive more intelligent automation as well as your more modularized network. And we do talk about disaggregation driving intelligent automation because of the upgrade cycles of those components. You move towards best of breed rather than best of suite. And that helps, again, drive more intelligent automation and automation best practice. And now that you've got that more disaggregated, that more modular network, you've got data that sits across teams in a more common data mesh, and you're thinking about more automation, you should be thinking about that northbound API discovery and how you can build on those 3 pillars of automation, cloud, and data to feed into an API that truly drives towards network as a service models and SaaS and PaaS on top of the network that you already offer. And the final stage then is scaling those differentiated services. So thinking about bringing AI into the data that you have to monetize that in new ways, thinking about your APIs in terms of monetizing data and scaling beyond just a handful of Kamara-driven, standards-driven APIs to a much more diverse portfolio, and then thinking about complete end-to-end cross-domain closed-loop automation across this modular architecture of your networks that can be flexibly pieced together and stitched together into different B2B propositions for different customer segments without the lengthy process of creating lots of different product catalogs and lots of different vertical stacks that need to be managed independently. So we see that as the final step to then kind of drive value as a scaled differentiated service provider and enabling you to move further up the stack. So I know I've gone through that again relatively quickly. We'll have a section at the end for any questions, but just if you want to let it percolate. But I will pause there just before I hand over to Rod in case anything on this framework and these 4 stages, and Ron will then go through kind of step by step a couple of examples trying to bring this to life. Any questions from the audience? Or obviously, as I said, do feel free to drop some in the chat. We can get to them at the end. Okay. In which case, Ron, over to you.
Thank you very much, Darius. And again, we did save some time at the end for questions and time for some interactive discussions. I had a chat with Darius. He recommended even the thought of having breakout rooms. I thought it worked. It doesn't work as well in these type of virtual events, but if we all stay silent, you're just going to prove him right. So again, I encourage you to come up with questions and comments. I'll try and do a quick run through relating to what Darius has shown with some practical examples we're seeing and encountering. I think one of the main things, like Darius said, it's not a set journey that you can say step by step, which is identical for every operator, right? Each business environment is different. Each environment of existing systems is different. Competition is different. Regulation. But I think, again, within this framework, we found some very good key examples. And like Darius will probably relate to at the end, this was like the first part of this research of kind of laying out the framework and the mapping and what we're seeing, whereas the second part, which we are in advanced work, is actually starting to map different operator profiles and have some practical recommendations, but we'll talk about it at the end. So maybe Darius will jump into the first slide of mine. I had, like Darius mentioned, I had 5G network and OSS product marketing in Amdocs. Yeah, no, we can stay on the first actual slide. So this is, again, after the extensive introduction by Darius, this is a bit redundant, I think. Obviously, the main things is the change, right? We're seeing change in network and in customer demands. It's not a sudden change. This has been happening for quite a while. The evolution in the network, which is very much in one of the key pillars we mentioned, the virtualization and cloud nativeness of the software functions, of the network functions, the programmability of the network. It opens a world of possibilities, but we are continuously seeing new elements coming into the network, right? So 5G slicing was hyped for many years, but we're seeing many different things, be it private networks, satellite connectivity, Wi-Fi 6, advances in SD-WAN and others. A lot of evolution to the networks and the dynamicity, the dynamic nature of the network. And in parallel, the customers' demands have evolved. And this is also something we've seen for years, right? Customers expect the on-demand experience, things to be live in minutes or even shorter than that, always on. And they've gotten used to this interaction they know from the public cloud, right? Clicking, seeing immediately what you get, getting it, paying it in a very clear model. And there is same expectations coming into the network, especially when you think of B2B and marketplace and B2B to X type models. So the need for this agile intelligent automation, I think, is clear. And if we move into the next slide, we did like a short recap of what Darius showed, right? So the 4 pillars: data, cloudification, and programmability, automation, and exposure. And Darius went very thoroughly into the different 3 stages. And actually, in the next slide, we try to pinpoint into a key message per pillar, right? So once again, the data, this journey that Darius shows was that we want to be able to get accurate, advanced insights from this data. But once again, network is a complex place. We have multiple different domains, multiple different vendors. It's continuously evolving. We have legacy systems, new systems, and right, we want everything to be playing nice together to exploit the data as much as possible. Traditionally for AI, now Gen AI is right, the new feature coming to the market. It will also need a very clear and structured and organized access to data, like Darius explained. The second pillar of kind of preparation, also the cloudification and programmability of the network. starting from the NFV days when the network became virtualized and separating the hardware from the software. But as we're moving to more cloud native functions, and the network is becoming really more and more programmable, which lays the foundation to have more increased, enhanced automation. I don't have that many boxes and the need to physically go and fix stuff, but many more things can be solved internally or through the embedded automation. Then Darius mentioned the automation, right? Reducing the number of human touch points in these processes that go multiple domains in the network, and also, by the way, other systems outside the network, having more intelligent, intent-driven automation, and intent is becoming a key thing we're seeing, right? How we get the business intent to be translated, fulfilled, and maintained across the network without having to program everything step by step. And the last, this promise of exposure, right? Network APIs is a very hot topic. It shows a lot of promise, right? Anybody who shows you a marketplace of access to the network, or once again, I mentioned the public cloud analogy that's already working in that way. We understand that we need to work on this exposure of network APIs. And again, Darius went through the stages. And actually now I wanted to give you, we selected one example that we are working with in the different domains, just to showcase, and these different examples are in different places in this evolution that Darius showed, but I think it was just, a nice way to see how different operators are exploring different places in this journey. So if we go to the next slide, I think the first pillar I wanted to talk about was the pillar of data exploitation. So obviously monitoring this data from across different domains. And we focus first on a key source of data, inventory. Inventory, and once again, we're seeing this with a lot of customers that have multiple inventories per network domain, or even sometimes per vendor. And this obviously means the data, even just on the inventory level, is very, siloed, and it's hard to get actionable end-to-end insights from that. Actually, in this project we did with Vodafone, we didn't look at inventories within a single operator, but across the different markets of different opcos of Vodafone. And the goal here was really to have this end-to-end layer, end-to-end user interface, and multi-source data management, this federation layer, that we have this unified approach and a single point of interaction for these different processes we see on the right that need to interact with the inventory data, right? The planning, fulfillment, the assurance, zero-touch operations, etc. So again, this was a unique case of having this federation layer. And like I mentioned, in many other projects that we have, we're actually coming to a single operator that has multiple inventories in-house, and he's looking for this federation layer to have this single point of access and a unified data management, and over time retire the older legacy systems. And this is relating also to this journey we're seeing, that you don't have to rip and replace everything on day one. You find your journey, start with a single layer, and once you see it's working and in place, you can start to have that take the place of the older systems and retire them. And maybe just one other note on the cross domain harmonization is the fact that while inventory used to be very much focused on the network resources and what I have available and what is used, we're seeing increasingly the need to inventory not represent only the network, but the service. Services are more complex, more dynamic. You need to understand not only the network topology, but also the service topologies that you have, because we're moving to more advanced and dynamic services. So this was the first example around data. And now, if we move to the next slide, I wanted to talk about a project that touches on cloudification and programmability. And again, Amdocs, we've been involved from the early days of NFV and ONAP, which was a lot of water went under the bridge since then, right? We evolved from VNF to CNF to cloud native functions. And again, it's not that the physical network functions have gone away so fast, but the evolution is ongoing, and we're running with it. And actually, this is a project we're doing with a tier one North American provider who is looking to create a 5G orchestration platform. They're looking to actually launch to market network slices And again, not starting immediately with a dynamic, on-demand small network slices, starting with the more handcrafted network slices, learning how to work with a slice that goes across multiple domains and can be pre-configured, so that it can evolve to the vision of the 5G slicing. But the central point here was actually to start at the beginning, right? At the design stage, the network design stage, and the onboarding of different network functions from different vendors, from different domains, right? Core, RAN, and additional network functions, physical, virtual, cloud native functions, onboarding all of them, right? And I believe the scope here was over 70 different network functions from multiple vendors. And then designing the network services, designing the slices that will come to life, chaining together the different network functions so that it can be accurately represented in the inventory and orchestrated in an automated way. So if you don't do this design properly, following openness, being standards aligned, because right, we're multi-vendor, multi-domain type environment, and we want a fast, cost-efficient integration. We can go into programming all of these interfaces between the different vendors, following a CI/CD process, and really having this cloud carrier-grade solution that can be scalable and secure to implement, and increasingly level. And of course, once this is done right, tomorrow when I have a new network function, I can onboard it in a much easier manner. It can fit in with the new wider ecosystem with reduced integration and complexity. Moving to the next pillar, we come to automation. And I think if we talked about data and the cloudification of programmability as kind of the building blocks, right? We want to leverage those two to enhance automation. And actually here, I chose a project we're doing with VodafoneZiggo, and we actually presented with them at the recent DTW conference. So actually here, Amdocs end-to-end service orchestration, the end-to-end SO, acted as the middle layer, as the network as a service layer. Now, when we hear NAS, network as a service, often the thought is around exposure. But here, actually, the focus was still on the internal exposure. So I have these multiple different network domains, and I want to leverage the open APIs and standard APIs to expose them in a standardized way. Primarily, again, the first goal is to the IT systems, right? Be it the commerce or care or monetization. So essentially the ground, the initial situation, as is the case in many situations, is multiple different IT systems and many different network domains on the bottom, which results in a crisscross, a spaghetti mix of integrations. And whenever you want to upgrade one of the network domains or one of the IT systems, you need to test out and see that everything is still working as planned. The goal here was to expose the different network domains with standard APIs, DNF APIs, and then essentially having these available like Lego building blocks, right? So you can replace them, upgrade them easily without having this crisscross integration. And it's also enabling to drive new business, because now I can build more complex and dynamic business services, B2B services that would leverage multiple network domains. And again, many other solutions and network domains can be added into here easily once you work with based on the standard APIs to enable enhanced automation. Right, so this is, although it's the automation pillar, you see it already touches on exposure, but since we are talking about this internal exposure, obviously the next level will be to take it, this that was done internally and exposed to portals and even to third parties that can leverage, and this ties into the fourth pillar of exposure. So we'll move to exposure, and I saw there were a few questions, but if it's okay, I'll finish in just a few minutes, and then we can touch on the questions and have an open discussion. So I'm not ignoring the questions. But now I wanted to talk about exposure, and I think as Darius mentioned, and as was shown in the the models and the survey results that we had, exposure is seen as a little bit of the more advanced feature, right? It's something more recent, and it has to build on everything we talked, right? If you don't have the appropriate data and programmability and automation, the exposure is kind of the next step. And as such, I think, I chose to take the TNF catalyst we did. It was called SHINE, which is an acronym of Simple Hyperscaler Integrated Network Experience. And as you can see here, the goal was to show how service providers, in this case, we had AT&T, Orange, and Telefonica, which were part of the Catalyst, how they would expose network services in a hyperscaler marketplace. So we had the Azure marketplace in this case, and then how an application developer or an enterprise or an SMB, anybody who would want to get quality on demand or a location API from any one of these three service providers, he would go into the Azure marketplace and order whatever he needed. And of course, the vision is not just to have these three operators, but have the ability to extend it even further. Now, obviously, and maybe Darius, if you could click on the marketplace visual here, yeah. So this is how it would look. Essentially, if I'm an enterprise, just like I go into Azure Marketplace to order cloud resources or whatnot, I would buy a quality on demand API or a location API from the service provider I wanted to. So if we go back just one slide, please. Sorry for the back and forth. Essentially, right, and I appreciate the fact commercially this is a complicated discussion to have. We didn't go into the commercial models here, right? Obviously, some service providers will want to expose directly or to address specific verticals, but there was huge interest because it is a way to reach a much, a wider mass market, and maybe, not big enterprises, but smaller businesses that don't have the capacity to globally go to each service provider independently and get what they need, but they could address and get the network requirements they need in this way. And maybe connected to everything we talked about, there's a lot of stuff that had to happen here, right? From the onboarding stage, how do I need to, and this was all part of the Catalyst, onboarding the different network services into the hyperscaler environment, then handling the order management, both on the hyperscaler side, right? How do I get and fulfill the order, and then fulfill it on the CSP side, in each one of them, going back into the network, having NAS orchestration in case I really need to start changing around configurations in the network, depending on what API was exposed. And again, in this case, obviously, most of the stuff was done in various labs because it's a Catalyst event. Enabling this API exposure. The charging and the partner settlement and billing were not part of this Catalyst at this stage. We're hoping to address that in stage number 2. And again, there was a lot of interest to hear how, once again, they're onboarded, ordered, and then used to enable new applications. And we did win the award of business growth. A lot of interesting discussion. I think one of the main points, I'm not saying this is going to be the go-to-market across the board, but obviously it shows that the work and a potential collaboration between service providers and hyperscalers. And at least if DTW was an indication, we'll probably have some discussions around this specifically, but I have one or two more slides, and then we can open up the floor. So click to, another one forward, please. And again, apologies for the relatively busy slide, but to me, I really like it because it's a summary slide of everything we tried to talk about here, right? We want to get to almost a cloud-like experience to the network, right? If on the top we have the business layer, the different applications, and the commerce and care and monetization and engagement, all on the top business layer, the bottom layer is the network, right? 5G, 4G, Wi-Fi, private networks, satellite, you name it, right? Any new network feature that can have cloud and edge, of course. We need this middle layer. Here we called it NAS, we called network platform, but this, everything that we talked about in this project is about how I need to connect the business intent and the business layer down into the dynamic programmable network. How do I get the intent? And intent is a key word, intent-driven, to be fulfilled in the network, where it needs to happen, how it needs to happen, and how do I maintain it, right? If I'm selling a service that requires low latency, I need not only to make it happen, I need to keep it throughout the service existence. How do I manage the end-to-end service lifecycle to keep that intent from the design, the launch, and the ongoing operation, and even the termination? Because the services are more dynamic, they're not expected to be there forever. We talked a lot about exposure already, and the decoupling and the abstraction of the network functions to abstract the complexity, and although the network is becoming more complex, and able to operate it in a simpler manner. And I think on the right, we put the standardize and reuse. These are key elements, right? I mentioned this kind of building block mentality. We talk to operators that still, talk about the difficulty in-house of moving to an API-driven interaction with the network domains. And they say, yeah, but we still have network engineers that say, no, just let me go into the CLI and configure whatever I want in my domain. I'll get it to work. And sure, you may get it to work faster in that specific case, but in the long run, it's not reusable, and any change or upgrade will require, again, connecting and configuring. And we put some sample KPIs here, right? So reducing OpEx by 50%, getting the services on demand from days to minutes, and of course the vision is even faster than that. Task automation over 95%, and once again, moving to dark NOCs and fully closed loop operation is a huge vision here. Reducing time to market, and again, these are different numbers from different projects. And on the left, we put the marketplace and B2B2X. These are, everybody talks about them from a business perspective, but without this middle layer and everything we talked about today, it's not going to happen. And I think this is a key thing, right? The main resource or benefit of service providers is their network resources, their assets. And if we want to have them as a key component in the services in the marketplaces in the B2B2X model, we need this middle layer of automation exposure. Can move to the next slide now. And just a word of how we're looking to pave the way to the automation, right? So on the right, we put these are some of Amdocs products as part of our next gen OSS solution, the Intelligent Networking Suite. And we're following this cycle of the ongoing, from the design of the networking service through the service and network orchestration, fulfilling the service, activating it through the ongoing operations, leveraging assurance in-house that will have you close the loop, and having the inventory, the single source of truth in the middle. And once again, this is in an ongoing manner to maintain the intent and enhance closed loop operations as much as possible. I think I covered most of the bullets here, right? End-to-end service and network lifecycle. By the way, end-to-end can mean a lot of things. It's across the lifecycle from the design and everything we see on the right, but it's also end-to-end from the digital layer to the network, and it's also end-to-end across the network. So those are a lot of cross-domain, multi-vendors. The second bullet, intent-driven automation. I think I mentioned it several times. We talked about standards and multi-cloud, modular. Once again, this whole collaboration with hyperscalers, which would be key, both from an operational perspective, but also from a business perspective. And I think the last slide I put is actually used to be the first slide in many presentations, right? The use cases and the elusive use cases of the 5G era. And I purposely put it at the end, right? We used to start with it, but and it's not about a specific use case here. I think if you proceed along this journey that we tried to show, and I think the main goals was like I mentioned in the beginning, was to have a practical approach. You'll be in a better position to jump on and adopt the use cases as they emerge and support the partner ecosystem, right? Be it for enterprise or consumer or B2B2X models, and giving these different services the new resources that we have in the network, right? Because the huge investment in the network, much of it was already made. Now, if we, to get it and to monetize it, the network, the operational paradigm has to change, and that's a lot of what we wanted to cover in this research. So I'm going to take a breath now. I think we're at the end, Darius, and I think we can open the floor. I saw there were a few questions, Darius. So
yeah, it looked like a few. It looked like a few came through. So again, if you do have any in the chat, do continue to throw them in. So I'll just work from the ones that I can see first. So we've got Nectaria, I think from BT. It's a question for you, Ron. What is Amdocs' role in the NAS value chain model? Are you playing more of an aggregator, an orchestrator, or other, I suppose?
So I think, again, predominant, at least in the UK, in the use case that I showed for VodafoneZiggo, or the NAS layer, we have the orchestrator capability, right? So we are having the APIs come in and defining the life cycle of how to interact with the different network domains. Having said that, just like we said on these journeys, it can be different models in different places, right? So some operators would look to having it the end-to-end or the NAS solution being a full orchestrating it end-to-end. In other situations, it can be more of an aggregation type of scenario. So, the bottom line is a little bit of it depends.
And then we've got a question from Navala at Telkom Malaysia, I think. So not all vendors are adopting standard open APIs. How is this challenge overcome by most? And additionally, was there any example of a full adoption of open APIs to date? How long did that journey take? So is this a question, I suppose, on the advancement of the GSMA Open Gateway project? And are there any telcos, I suppose, not going down that route versus the telcos that are going down that route? How long might that take before commercial scale? And I don't, Ron, if you want to go first, then I've got some opinions on that as well.
So maybe I'll start how long. The journey is taking a while, right? So obviously we're showing things, and I think even with some of the references that I showed before, it's not that everything happened in day one. By the way, it's not always from a vendor perspective. Like I mentioned, often it's difficulties in-house, right? Changing mindsets of internal workers within the CSPs. I think most vendors are looking to at least align with standard open APIs. I don't think everything is going to be exact plug and play, but following the standardization. And again, there's also issues there of having multiple standard bodies and what is the final definition. I think we are seeing an increase as an increased requirement by our customers. And of course, for us, at the end of the day, and that we're not a network vendor, right? We are always interacting. We have charging functions and policy functions, but when we talk to different network functions in the RAN and the core and in other places, we always interact with third parties. And again, the only fact is if you don't follow, I would say the less you rely on standard open APIs, the more effort there is in integration, right? And that's a balance that we see our customers are starting to take into consideration. Sorry.
Yeah, and I agree. I think the timing will obviously depend, but I do think operators, because I guess if we take a step back, we've tried open APIs before. I think there was the GSMA One API project, over a decade ago, trying to push telcos towards this kind of model, and it didn't really work. And why didn't it work? Because again, it's trying to drive standards, it was trying to drive the federated model. And I think a part of that that's different now is that obviously there's 5G, so it is naturally supposed to be more softwareized, more programmable. But I also think there's a different ecosystem competition model now. And the need to standardize comes from the scale, I suppose, that hyperscalers have in the play, for example, or more global players have, and operators needing to act more like that to become a more cloud-like or hyperscale-like platform. Because again, if I'm a developer and I need to work with an individual operator within each market to build an application, that's prohibitively expensive and time consuming for me. Whereas I can work with AWS and I can write one application to serve many regions. And I think that dynamic and the strength of the internet players that maybe wasn't as apparent before, I think will drive operators towards more standardization. But as we've spoken about, there will be a need to use standards to understand the developer, to understand how to expose functions correctly, to start to test the model. And then operators will need to find a way, I think, to innovate within that area and to start to drive their own differentiation through API models, through the APIs that are offered and the end use cases that sit on top, as well as in the actual monetization of the API. What's the commercial strategy? So there's a question here from Milan Sunrise. Is runtime service orchestration module embedding CSMF/NSMF in the context of 5G slicing? So I think that's a question for you, Ron. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So again, I think when talking about end-to-end service orchestration, end-to-end SO, and we've been looking into it for quite a few years now. And of course, one of the first use cases that came to mind was 5G slicing, right? And again, maybe a little bit of as 5G started, as we all know, I think it was already in 2019, everybody was pitching the network slice, the on-demand slice for a remote surgery, etc., which is complicated to do. But as such, when we developed the end-to-end SO concept, one of the first use cases we looked in was, yes, network slicing. So having the the end-to-end service orchestrator act as the CSNF, the communication service management function that would translate the intent to the network slice management function. And then you can have the different domains, which is the NSSNF. But so for sure, one of the key use cases we are seeing for end-to-end service orchestration is around slice management and implementing CSNF and being CSNF and NSNF. We have done multiple proof of concepts with various operators where we act as these two functions, integrating, by the way, with one of the leading RAN vendors and leading 5G core vendors, and also orchestrating applications at the edge. So all of these are key considerations and things we're seeing evolve more and more. Having said that, as the realization that slicing is not that trivial, it is complex, especially the dynamic overpitched use cases. We are seeing additional scenarios where end-to-end service orchestration is needed, right? Be it complex B2B services, leveraging SD-WAN, and even internal exposure like the use case I showed in-house.
Makes sense. Now we've got a question from Ian, and it's how do we prevent cost overrun when knowledge and competency may be lacking? And again, if I try and interpret the question, I think what this is saying is where there may be a gap in skills within a telco, how do you make sure that trying to fill that gap doesn't lead to overinvestment or a risky investment? I guess, how do you de-risk the idea of upskilling? So Ian, if you're still on the call and I haven't understood that correctly, do come off mute and let me know. But I guess my perspective on this would be there will always be areas where telcos do not have lots of skills. And I think one, if we take API monetization or private networks edge monetization, I think the major gap at the moment for telcos is a knowledge of the end customer and the end developer. I think that's a big skills gap. And I think if we take one of the other pillars around cloud and the move towards programmability, I think it's software skills. I think that's a big skills gap. Now, if we take the first element, so thinking about use cases, the understanding of the developer, the enterprise, for me, the way that you de-risk that as a telco and you make sure that you're not over-investing or you're not risking money is to think about where do I prioritize my efforts, which sounds kind of simple, but it's a kind of rigorous understanding of what are my capabilities to date, how does that tie in with the customer base in my market, which verticals, therefore, should I be targeting, and how can I build on my network to make a right to play here and to build a compelling proposition. So it's not about just running headfirst into acquisitions to go straight into software and move straight into trying to be a cloud player. It's about the build on top of networking capabilities within a prioritized area where you have a right to play. And I think TELUS is a really good example of this, TELUS Health, where they acquired almost 15 years ago Emergis, which was helping them make a play within the healthcare space. And then leveraging their network, they built a kind of platform, the TELUS Health Data Exchange, looking at authentication and data management and data sharing. And from that, they then leveraged that platform to move into solutions and applications. So what they did over a long period of time was very much consolidate the strategy of wanting to become a key player in the Canadian healthcare market. And so they did make investments and they did make acquisitions and they did look to partner to build that vertical credibility and to build those skills. But they did it over a longer period of time. They did it tied to a strategy that they had for a number of years. And they did it based on clear prioritization. And again, they also had very different metrics to measure the success of that investment. So it wasn't immediate returns or immediate revenues. It was more around, how do we build a proposition? Is this tied to the vision that we want? And can we look at this over 3 to 5 years rather than 1 to 2 years? The flip side would be something like Telstra, where they do play within healthcare, but started trying to enter the market at a similar time to TELUS, but through a pretty dodgy acquisition strategy that said, I'm just going to acquire lots and lots of different businesses within health to build skills. They did end up with a lot of risk, and I think had to lay off quite a bit of that acquisition. And so that was a waste of money. So for me, that's because they didn't have a targeted enough approach. So that's one element, is thinking about how do you build vertical skills and developer skills through partnerships and acquisitions and through a prioritized approach. The other element I mentioned was software skills. And I think this is hard. I think that does come with time, but I think it comes with working with partners in a different way to maybe how telcos work in the past. I think I mentioned previously cloud or agility being something telcos want to buy rather than something they want to do. And I think having spoken to telcos like Deutsche Telekom, Telefonica, etc., what they're quite vocal and open about is that they're looking to partner to accelerate their move towards these technologies, but they want to be actively involved in the process so that they can teach themselves to fish. And so in that way, they're working with a partner that has the credibility, has the skills, helping them move towards the goal, but also learning from the process rather than a complete step back and outsource. So those would be two things that I'd raise on that. But I don't know, Ron, if you had any perspectives as well.
I think one of my perspectives is the telecom industry. If you look at a few years, put it this way, it used to be slow. It learned to move faster, right? It used to be much more slow moving industry, traditional, looking. And I think over the last few years, there is an understanding that you need to keep on the edge of technology. By the way, this is also true from the vendor perspective, right? So, if you, a decade ago, cloud native wasn't a thing so much, and DevOps, wasn't relevant to the telco industry. Very quickly became important throughout the stack and throughout the network functions and how to manage that. And just like, we did these processes within Amdocs through internal upskilling and everything that you mentioned, and training and acquisitions and collaborations with hyperscalers, for example, we're seeing a lot of our customers also do that, to increase the knowledge of talent in-house. And I think we're right now, if we take, the latest, if you think of Gen AI as kind of the latest technology maturing and coming to play and how that can be leveraged, I think that's something that everyone around the world realized, wow, this is something that can really bring benefit. Jumping on this, learning how to work, it's just one example, right? We can apply to many different technology advancements. And I think overall, there's a good understanding that, that you need to be much more agile and moving with industry trends. The other thing that I think, sometimes you even see this, contribute to a separation of Netco and Telco, but that might be a ServCo and Netco, but that's a different type of discussion, maybe, which can also contribute to that.
And I think the question also does raise, I mentioned it briefly with the kind of TELUS model, right? Having different metrics to measure the success. I think this question does raise how do telcos take more risks and not think about ROI within 1 to 2 years, or how do they move away from what we call a cost plus mentality of, okay, I've had to build this capability, I've taken stack X from vendor Y, and I've taken stack Z from vendor W, and I need to add a margin on top of that to recoup my investment and to make my profit and to share dividends with my shareholders, because telcos are a dividend stock. I think last year Vodafone paid 10% yield. I think the average for the telecoms industry was around 7 or 8%, and the average for the techcos is probably closer to 1 or less. Right? The value that they create for shareholders is in growth, and the market sees that value and therefore attributes a much higher market cap to the hyperscalers into the techcos than a telco. And a lot of that is based on the risk that those techcos can take in building products that are loss leaders, that are discounted to drive scale for the platform, in trying to invest in areas that might drive scale later on, but saying, look, this may not make revenues for 3 years, but in 4 years' time, we'll be the market leader here. It's a very different model for telcos that need quick return. They need to provide value every quarter to shareholders through dividends, and they're more tightly regulated in that regard. So, you could see that risk model of where do I invest cost, or how am I allowed to invest cost, being a bit of a hindrance for operators at the moment, and something that strategy teams and decision makers and C-level execs need to push the finance, the CFO and the CEO to try and shift that model and say, let's allocate more to R&D spend rather than investment in just CapEx and in the network. Of that R&D spend, let's allow some to be measured based on different KPIs and metrics, rather than having each product line have its own P&L, which I think is true in the telco, rather than, as we said earlier, looking at it as the sum of the parts.
Okay. I think just one word to add to that, 2 words. One thing is, and it connects to what I talked about before, that moving from the, I guess, engineer mindset of if it's not broken, don't fix it. So like I said, caused, I think, a lot of legacy systems to stay in place. And I think now we're seeing a lot of projects of once again, you don't rip and replace from day one, but how do I evolve? How can I work my way to advance further? That's one point. And obviously upskill my people in the process. And the other thing is, and I think you mentioned it also, that the collaboration with hyperscalers, which can take many different ways, right? And we could pick 10 different operators and hyperscalers example, and in each place it will be a different type of relationship. So I mean, just more to emphasize that there's different ways to advance on this path, which are impacted by a whole bunch of stuff.
Absolutely. So I'm conscious of time, wanted to move into the wrap up phase. So what we've presented there was the first step, phase one of this research, where we were looking at the maturity framework, thinking about those four pillars and the sub stages of telco transformation and automation in the network. The next step in phase two is to think about how operators may move through that journey slightly differently. Where are operators? Where are different sets of operators, possibly based on region, based on prior investment, historic capabilities, based on the nature of their market? Where are they in terms of that maturity? And can we, through cluster analysis of the survey respondents, pull out different profiles of how operators may move through that journey and how they may look at those different holistic buckets in different ways? So we've defined four profiles from the survey data, those that are more early stage in profile one versus those that are more advanced in profile four. And then two in the interim, those that may have prioritized data first versus those that may have prioritized virtualization and cloud first. And again, for each of these profiles, we lay out key characteristics and the market dynamics. We think about their strategic objectives. We think about their maturity against our framework. And we've provided some recommendations on the priorities for their investment. So again, from our four pillar model with three substages, what's the next step for you? Where should you be prioritizing your investment so that you don't, as Ian raised, end up spending costs in other areas to upskill or build capabilities that aren't as effective or as efficient? So the idea behind these profiles is to prioritize and help operators think about where they should be investing next in transformation and automation. And we'll be presenting some of this along with a report at an event at Barcelona. So I think a lot of people's attention now it's coming towards the end of the year, turn to MWC Barcelona. It's such a big event for most of the people on this call. And so with Amdocs, again, we'll be presenting the phase two output of this research, thinking about those different profiles, where did different operators move through that journey, and what are some of the key recommendations for each of those different market segments. So it'll be on the Wednesday morning, hopefully wrapping up before most of the keynotes would start. It's very close to the FIRA, so it's only a 3-minute walk away. And of course, for anyone at this event, you'll have the kind of priority access to register. It will be a little bit smaller in comparison to this event, just based on space in the room. So do please, if you're interested, kind of pre-register, and we can share at least a blocker for your calendar. And as said, we'll be deep diving into the second phase of this research over some free light refreshments and a breakfast briefing. And I think just the last thing from me is we'd love your feedback on how this has gone. And so do please look at the QR code and submit your feedback. We'll be sharing the slides afterwards, so you'll have the QR code offline as well. And we'll also share the registration link for the Barcelona event, as well as the report off the back of this phase of work and the next phase of work. So quite a lot of content to look out for from us, and quite a lot of new insights to be driving. And I think, in fact, Anna has just posted the link for the MWC event kind of pre-sign up in the chat as well. So if you're interested in those profiles and thinking about how different operators will move through that journey, and of course, if you'll be at MWC Barcelona, please do register. And if you think it would be relevant for any colleagues based on the content you've seen today, do feel free to forward to them as well, and we'll be able to capture their registration. I don't know, Ron, if anything final on your side.
No, just I wanted to thank everyone for listening in. Hope it was interesting, and looking forward to meeting you at Barcelona.
Perfect. Well, thanks a lot, everyone. We'll be in touch shortly.